Hi, Apes. So today we are going to start looking at some critical lenses. And in English classes, high-level English classes, generally this is where English people, English majors start going, is they start looking at critical lenses. They love critical lenses. So far in our class is essentially an intro to literature, a college level intro to literature. We would just get an introduction to this, right? And that's where we're going. We're not going to get terribly deep in critical lenses, but I do want you to know it because this is an intro to literature class. The lens that we've been doing primarily in our class is the formalist lens, and we need to, when we're preparing for the test, continue to do our work from just that lens. But I do want to introduce you to other lenses, and then we'll have a little mini project where we'll utilize some of these lenses, and it's kind of fun. Before I get into them and start defining some, I do like this analogy or this metaphor where we talk about lenses as like different pairs of glasses. So let's say I have Moby Dick in front of me and I'm reading it. I can put on I have a whole bunch of glasses, metaphorical glasses, and I can put them on and read the text from a different lens, right? So maybe I'm reading Moby Dick and I put on my formalist glasses and I'm reading in a certain way and looking for certain things. But then maybe I pick up a different pair of glasses, maybe my gender lens glasses, and now I'm looking for something totally different in the text from a different context, right? I'm looking at Moby Dick in a whole different way. And that's what you kind of have to think about with lenses. Is you're putting on a pair of glasses and you're going to look at a text in a specific way. All right, so you're going to take some notes. You have a graphic organizer, and I'm just going to generally define these. You put them in your own words. So here's the first one. We already kind of talked about this. Formalist lens, right? This is the one that we primarily focus on in AP Lit because the test wants us to be formalists, right? The College Board wants us to read like formalists. So formalism means that you read the text and you only care what's on the page. So when you're reading an Emily Dickinson poem as a formalist, you do not care that Emily Dickinson committed suicide by putting her head in her oven and turning on the gas. That has nothing to do on the poem. You cannot bring in any outside influences on the text. It has to be just what's on the page. So that's what we've been doing primarily the whole year, is reading formally using the formalist lens. And so we care about theme, we care about commas, we care about dashes, we care about motifs, we care about symbols, we care about metaphors, we care about imagery. We do not care about the author's life. We don't care about the history. We don't care about our own feelings. We care about nothing but the text, right? And some people view this as a very cold way of reading literature. I personally really like formalism. It's kind of my jam. I like looking at just what's on the page and trying to get stuff out of the text by itself. I think that it enriches the text, right? So I'm a formalist through and through, right? So the next lens is biographical. So when you're reading from a biographical lens, you put on your biographical glasses, you then care about what happened in the author's life. So if I'm reading The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, I'm going to go and read a biography of Hemingway as well, or study Hemingway, do research about what his life was like. And I'm going to say, oh, Hemingway served in the military. That's why this book is so violent. Or he went to Spain for a while and lived there. That's why this book has bullfights, right? So you just look at the character or the author's life, and you then talk about how his or her life influenced the work. This is where we would say, okay, well, Emily Dickinson committed suicide. So obviously Emily Dickinson was kind of depressed. That's why her poems are the way they are. That's why they're so dark, right? Is because she was depressed. Okay. You can psychoanalyze the authors. You can talk about their problems. And then how does that translate to the novel or poem? The next one is psychological. And when you're doing the psychological lens, you are not psychoanalyzing the author. Remember, that was biographical, okay? You are psychoanalyzing and giving psychological diagnoses to the characters in the text. So when we're doing a psychological lens, we can say, look at Marlowe in Heart of Darkness, and we could say, I think Marlowe has a split personality disorder. And maybe we're saying that Kurtz is part of his personality and Marlowe is the other half. And then we're going to, use, our research of psychology to then explain Marlowe's actions in the novel. Or, psychological lens people really like the theories of Sigmund Freud, even though Freud isn't super highly regarded anymore. They do really gravitate, English majors that write from this really gravitate towards Sigmund Freud and the id, ego, superego, and the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex. The Oedipus complex is when a character, it's from Oedipus, right? You remember Oedipus last semester? And it's a male character that is in love with their mother, wants to have sex with their mother, and wants to kill their father. That's the Oedipus complex. So they love looking from those sort of lenses with psychological, like Sigmund Freud theories and stuff like that. Id, ego, superego, that's their jam. So then we have a bigger, broader group of historical lenses. There's a whole bunch. I'm going to give you the 4 most important ones, right? So here is our first historical one. This is literary history. Now, literary history is where you look at the time period of the author and how that affects the work. So you have to see when they're writing it. So you would look at The Great Gatsby and say, well, Fitzgerald is writing this in the 1920s. And so we're looking at how his ideas of the 1920s, how that affected him as a person and thus affects the work. So you're worried about when it was written, not necessarily when the story is about. So if Great Gatsby had been written in the 1960s, you would talk about how the 1960s affected this book about the 1920s, right? Kind of interesting. You're worried about when the author is writing it, that time period. And you're going to do a bunch of historical research. Okay. So the next one is Marxist theory. So in Marxist theory, you're going to talk about socialism and communism. You're going to primarily use the works of Karl Marx, the father of socialism, thus why it's called Marxist theory. And you're looking for characters that are being disenfranchised because of their social class. And so Great Gatsby is a great example of this because we have multiple classes. And so you could say that Myrtle, the reason Myrtle dies in that book is because she's of a lower class. And if she had been part of the upper class, she would have survived, right? That sort of idea. And so you would talk about how Myrtle as a character is being disenfranchised by the other characters because of her social class. That's what you're working on in Marxist theory. Okay. This is a new historical. This one is really similar with literary history, and I get the two mixed up quite often. So new historical is when you look at the historical context of the actual novel, like the time period of the story and how that affects it. So you're not looking at the author and when he's writing it, you're looking at the story. So with Great Gatsby, it's a story about the 1920s. So you would talk about, okay, this is the 1920s and this is what's going on. So how does this connect to the characters in the novel, right? Whereas literary history was more about the author. This is more about the time period of the novel, right? And so, really easy one. You just research the time period and, what do you see? What similarities or differences do you see in the novel? The last historical one we're going to cover is post-colonial. And this one is also really super popular with English people, English majors. So post-colonial is where you're going to look at the effects that colonialism has on the novel. So, for instance, Heart of Darkness would be a great one for this because that's what it's all about, right? They're taking an African country and making it a colony, and you're looking at how the characters are being disenfranchised because they are not part of the conqueror's country. They're a colony of a greater power. and how that works. Things fall apart works for this really well as because there's colonists that are coming in. So that's post-colonial. So those are our four main historical ones. They're all slightly different, but they're all looking at history, right? Now we have gender. Now before, when I was in college, there wasn't such a thing as a gender lens. It was just feminist lens, right? But because we know more and we've grown as a society, now we call it gender lens. This has to do with any character in a novel that is being disenfranchised because of their gender. So feminism is under this. Gay and lesbian lens is under this. Trans lens is under this. Anybody who is being disenfranchised or put down because of their gender, that's what you're going to look at. Primarily characters, because remember, we're not looking at the author. That's biographical lens. It's just the characters here. So then mythological lens. This one is often confused by students because they think, we're going to go look at Greek myths and we're going to say, look how this Greek myth. No, we're not doing that. So in mythological, you were only looking at the hero cycle as put forth by Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was this great literary theorist, and he found patterns in all of our stories. And he said, look, all these stories have the same, 12 steps, right? So that's what you're looking at, is the hero cycle and the hero's journey. So you're looking at how does this story follow the hero's journey. I really like this lens. It's one of my favorite. Thus, this is one of the reasons I teach that mythology class. I really like this whole idea of stories all following the same. And really, every story is just a hunt for the Holy Grail, right? You just have to identify what the Holy Grail is. Okay, reader response. This one is the one that you've probably done the most in your life. So after a lot of these theories had been developed, there was a group of people that really fought against it. And they go, you know what? None of this other stuff matters. The only thing that matters is the conversation between the reader and the book. And so what you do with reader response is you write your feelings and your thoughts down as you're going through the novel. Now, I do this anyway when I read a book. If I'm reading a literary book and I'm annotating, I write down my thoughts and feelings. But I don't necessarily talk about my thoughts and feelings in a discussion because I don't know that they're necessarily valid for another person, right? They're just for me. And reader response is very touchy-feely. And so you can interpret the text as essentially any way you want, as long as you're feeling it, right? As long as you felt that. You're like, this part was really, really sad because I felt sad. Doesn't matter what's on the page. It's your feeling at the time, which I at least see as problematic because, you could be reading a really happy part of a book and feel really sad because something else in your life is affecting you to do that, So reader response. You were doing this when you were in third grade, second grade. You were talking about your thoughts and feelings about the story and how it made you feel, right? The last one we're going to talk about is deconstructionist. This one is the most difficult. So the deconstructionists then came way later and they said, you know what? All of these are wrong. We're going to do something entirely different. And they said that they're going to break the text because what they decided was once a text has been interpreted by people, then it's all stuck, right? Like we all have the same interpretations over and over and over. We never get anywhere new. So we have to break the text. So what they like to do is take a text and then break it apart and find contradictions in the text that break it so that the traditional interpretation of that text is no longer valid. So what I love to do this is that poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Because Robert Frost, essentially, most people interpret the poem as saying, well, if I, take the road less traveled, it will make all the difference in my life. But the problem with that poem is Frost says that he never comes back to that path. He never goes and takes the other path that he didn't take. So how can he really know that his path was the better path, right? And how can he really know that going on the other one wouldn't have been better for him or the same, right? And he says that, one path is better than the other in the end of the poem, but at the beginning he says that both looked the same and both were worn down the same amount. So then really the two paths are the same, right? So that's what a deconstructionist would do, is they would argue that the poem breaks itself down and what you thought was the correct interpretation of this work is not actually the correct interpretation. Okay, so those are the main lenses that we're going to cover in class. Like I said, we will do a project with these a little later, but right now all you need is the definitions. All right, bye.